Hello, welcome to the latest CCHP video FAQs on licensure. My name is May Kwong. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Connected Health Policy. Today, we are going to do a little bit something different on our videos. We are going to go over the most frequently asked questions that CCHP receives on state licensure. Before we get started, a couple of disclaimers. Please know that any information provided in today's talk is not to be regarded as legal advice. It is strictly for informational purposes. CCHP always recommends that you consult with legal counsel if you are interested in a formal legal opinion. Also, if I happen to mention a company or show a picture of a product, know that neither I nor CCHP has any type of relevant financial interest arrangement, relationship, or affiliation with such a company. So we get a lot of questions through our technical assistance line regarding state licensure, especially the past 2.5 years with COVID, because a lot of states actually did temporary waivers in response to the pandemic. So we're going to go over the most frequent questions that we receive, just in case you have one of these questions burning in your mind as well, too. So the first question that we go over, and the one that we receive most frequently is, I'm licensed in state X and want to provide services in state Y. Can I do that? Well, for the most part, yes, you can do that, but you would need to be licensed in that state Y, that other state. And that's because most states actually have laws or policies in place regarding the practice of medicine or practice of or provision of healthcare services within their state borders. And for the most part, states say you need to be licensed or certified by that state in order to provide those services. Let's give you a couple examples here. So in California, it says for physicians using telehealth technologies to provide care to patients located in California, you must be licensed in California. And that is some guidelines and regulations by the Medical Board of California. Now, there are sometimes some narrow exception to these licensing laws. So for the most part, you need to be licensed in the state that the patient is located in order to provide healthcare services legally. But sometimes there may be very narrow exceptions that a state has. And we have an example here of Kentucky says a provider must be licensed in Kentucky with the exception who, if they're non-residents Kentucky and they're lawfully licensed to practice medicine in another state, they infrequently engage in the practice of medicine in Kentucky. So if you're doing like a one-off consultation or something, Kentucky's okay if you do that without a Kentucky license. But if you're providing regular service into the state of Kentucky, they're going to want you to be licensed. And you see this in a couple other states, these narrow exceptions, such as if you're providing a one-off services or if you're consulting with a provider who is actually treating the patient within the state and they are licensed by that state. Or sometimes if you have states who maybe have a lot of people close to the border and you are contiguous with that state, they may allow you to practice within a certain distance from the border and not be licensed by their state. You see that a lot in like that tri-state area of Maryland, DC, and Virginia, and in some of those East Coast states, just because they're smaller states and they tend to have more proximity to the border, more people proximity to the border. So those are some of the narrow exceptions that you see, but they're very specific, they're very narrow, and they're not widespread throughout the states. So the rule of thumb is you have to be licensed in order to provide services into another state. Question 2, I am moving to a new state, but still see patients in my old state. Do I need a license in my new state, or can I still see clients via telehealth in my old state without going through that process? For the most part, most states are actually, or practically all states are silent on this particular scenario. They're really just concerned if you're providing healthcare services within their state borders, so patients located within their state. They're not so much concerned about what you're doing outside of those state borders to like other states. We don't have like an on-point example, but something that we did find here is with the District of Columbia. First off, they say, like, if you're going to practice medicine within the District of Columbia, you got to be licensed by us. But they also do say, for states rendered outside of District of Columbia, the provider's services shall meet any licensure requirement of the jurisdiction in which the patient is physically located. So they're saying, like, you do need to go and obey, like, that other state laws and regulations if you're providing services in there. But they're silent on like what are your obligations if you're doing that in DC. They're not saying that you need to be licensed by DC if you're providing services outside of DC. They're just saying like just remember to follow the laws and that you're licensed in like that other state. And you're going to find that with the majority of states that they're actually silent on this particular question here. Question 3, very frequent question, especially during the pandemic. This came up a lot. My patient is going to college or going on extended vacation to another state. Can I still see my patient for continuity of care purposes? So in this scenario, you have established a relationship with the patient, but they happen to be going out of state. So what do you do in that situation? So again, there are a couple examples. There's an example here. It's not with physicians or nurses. It's in social work and it's Illinois. And it's similar to like what we covered a little bit earlier, where they're saying that, you know, there's a certain limit of services that you can provide to a patient who's located within our state borders, like a certain amount of services. So for social work, they're saying a person who's not a resident of Illinois is not prohibited from performing social work. So someone who is licensed in social work and you're using telehealth to provide services in Illinois, but you're not licensed by Illinois, you can go ahead and do that, not more for 5 days in any 1 month or more than 15 days in a calendar year that had a previously established therapeutic relationship with a non-resident, and that person is authorized to perform services under the laws of the state or country in which the person resides. So this is our scenario of somebody who is traveling, let's say for vacation, and is in Illinois. Let's say they came from Indiana, and they're in Illinois for vacation for like about 10 days, and they want to see their social worker who is in Indiana but is not licensed in Illinois. Illinois is saying that, yes, you can go ahead and do that if it's not more than 5 days in a month or 15 days in a calendar year. So there are, again, a couple of states do have these narrow exceptions where you're talking about people who are, excuse me, not establishing residency in another state. Maybe they're a college student or you're traveling for a vacation. But again, they're very narrow exceptions. And for the most part, the majority of states actually don't have these on their books. Illinois is an exception there, and there's like about 1 or 2 other states. But again, this is another area where a lot of states are pretty silent on it. However, you do have like that established relationship with the patient before, and you are licensed in your state. It's this gray area of policy that states haven't really fleshed out more specifically here. So this is like kind of a rare example that we have where we do have something down in writing on what they'll do. But you also notice it's for social work, so it's not even the medical board if you're a physician, or if you're a nurse. It's not even one of your boards that's doing this as well too. Question 4, I am providing educational services to someone in another state. Do I need to get a license? Now, I don't have an example for this particular question because, again, this is not an area where there's a lot of established policy, but it's also a tricky area. So this, you usually get this question for somebody who's saying, I am not treating the patient. I am not providing healthcare services. I am providing them with educational services, let's say dietary advice. Now, the tricky part of this is that, are you providing educational services or are you providing health services as well? How is that viewed? How is that going to be looked at, the type of service that you're providing? If it is strictly educational services, I could not find an example in any state, so I'm just going to say like the majority, if not all states, are silent on that particular issue. Where it does get tricky, I think, for the provider is that to be very careful and mindful if the service you are providing is strictly educational, or could it be considered healthcare services? If it's considered healthcare services, you're going to run into those licensure issues and licensure laws and policies as well. I am traveling in Europe for a month and would like to be able to see my patients while there. Can I see the patients legally via telehealth? So very similar to an earlier question of the patient is traveling, they're going to a different state. We're now talking about a different country now. And for the most part, again, a gray area, mainly because like when a lot of these laws are established, nobody considered like, well, how do you see the patient? You can't see them physically if you're physically in Europe. But now with telehealth, they're able to do that. So there is like really no established policy on this as far as laws on licensure. However, there are payment policies depending on what payer you may have. So Medicare and Medicaid actually have laws or policies rather, where they say that if you are located outside of the United States and its territories, they may not reimburse you for the services that you provided. So, for example, here in Missouri Medicaid, they said payment cannot be made to any financial institutions, telemedicine providers, pharmacies, or other entities outside the US and US territories. Now, that does not say physically located outside of the US and US territories at the time of the telehealth um, interaction. I think this is more about if you are say, a company or somebody who has their practice outside of the United States, they're saying we can't give you Medicaid money to pay for that services because you're located outside of the United States. So maybe it doesn't quite fit our vacation example, but I wanted to point this out and make you aware that this is something that is in Medicaid and in Medicare policy when they're talking about a provider who is outside of the United States. It's not on the licensure, it's about you getting paid. So it's not talking about licensure, but it's something I wanted to point out to. And I think CMS with Medicare is actually a little bit stricter where they said, like, yes, if you are physically located outside, even though you may be billing from your practice, which is located in the United States, but if you are physically located outside during the telehealth interaction, then you're not going to get paid. So I only point that out that the licensure question, vague, nothing really established, but when you're talking about public funds like Medicaid and Medicare, they do have some policies about that on the reimbursement side of things, not necessarily the licensure question. Question 6, it's the opposite. It's like, my patient is traveling internationally. Can I see them legally via telehealth? Again, nothing really established. And this is probably going to talk more about the laws of the country that the patient is in. So if they're traveling internationally and they are located in another country at the time of the telehealth interaction, you're actually under then that other country's laws, not necessarily United States laws or the laws of the state that you are physically in. So again, another gray area, it's probably going to depend on the country that the patient is traveling in. Our COVID-19 licensure waivers still in effect. For the most part, a lot of the state licensure waivers have expired. So there are still, I think, in a couple in effect, but for the most part, they have expired. It varies from state to state, so you're just going to have to check the state to see like what's still active in that state. And then question 8, I am only providing consultation services to a provider in another state. The care for the patient stays with the provider. Do I need to be licensed in that state? Again, it will depend on the state. There are a couple of states that have specific policies regarding this scenario and other states that are silent or don't address it. Here's an example of a state that does address it is Washington State, where they say there's no prohibition against a consultation. If you are working with a provider, if you're licensed in your state or territory and you're working with a practitioner who's licensed in Washington, and that Washington licensed provider has ultimate responsibility for diagnosis and treatment of the patient who is within the borders of Washington, that's totally fine. So not all states have this clear type of policy, so you're going to have to check on the state, and you may be interested in a state that actually is silent on this issue. But there are a couple of states that do have like a very specific policy, and Washington is an example of that. So that is it for our most frequently asked questions on licensure. I hope this has been helpful to you. If you are interested in some of CCHP's other videos or some of the other resources we have, such as fact sheets, or if you are interested in looking up what a state does, we do have our policy finder for all 50 states, District of Columbia, and coming later this fall, we will also be covering Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. You can go to our website at cchpca.org. Keep in mind that when this video was being recorded, it was September 12th, 2022. So if you are looking at this a couple of months later, the policies may have changed in some states. So I always encourage you to check our policy finder because that would have more up-to-date information. Thank you once again, and I hope to see you on another video here with CCHP.